All right, today we're going to go over safety and risk. Um, this is an important topic. This is another topic that we could spend all semester talking about, and we only have 60 minutes. So if I gloss over something, I'm sorry. Um, if you want to talk about it in more detail, feel free to contact me. But we just don't have enough time to cover everything. So engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Perform services only in areas of their competence. Issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. Act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. Avoid deceptive acts. Conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. So we need to talk about what is safe. Something being safe tends to be subjective. And the general public, their concept of safe is very skewed. They don't tend to assess risks. A lot of times, if you just don't tell them about certain risks, they won't worry about them and you won't have to deal with them. Legally, from an ethical standpoint, you really should be sharing and defining the risks to the general public. The general public is very bad at defining what a risk is. The general public tends to be very bad at figuring out what makes risk worse. They have no ability to do serious research, which is a pet peeve of mine when functioning adults said, I've done my research. And the general public's concept of tolerable risk tends to be a little skewed. So we do need to define some terms here. So risks are the potential negative consequences of hazards associated with a particular thing or activity. Risks are the possibility of undesirable outcomes that may arise from a certain course of action or situation. Judged. So this is making an assessment based on careful considerations of relevant factors. It involves deciding or decisions based on available information or criteria, and then what is acceptable. That's the risk associated with a particular thing or activity that are deemed tolerable within a reasonable or permissible range in accordance with established standards or guidelines. It suggests that the level of risk is considered reasonable and can be managed or mitigated effectively. Now, I want you to think about this. When it comes to anything that engineers get involved with, can the general public first figure out what the risks are? What potentially could go wrong? Can they actually do that on their own? Once they figure out what could go wrong, can they figure out what would cause it to go wrong? And what would make those things more possible? Before the Weather Channel was available, do you honestly think it occurred to people to check how's the weather today before they would go flying? Or would they only look up as they were getting to the airport? And what's a tolerable risk? And this is where I am guilty of behaving like the general public. I can tell you that airplanes need to have a very high redundancy level, that the risk of any piece of equipment failing needs to be less than 1 in 10,000, and that one piece has to have 3 redundancies, which means that the chance that it will fail is 1 divided by 10,000 quantity to the 3rd power. That is very small. However, that piece of information doesn't cross my mind while I'm flying. What crosses my mind is that scene in Fight Club when the 2 planes fly into each other. So when you talk about risk, there's three types of people that you want to think about when you're dealing with risk. There's the risk averse. They frequently overestimate risk. Um, I am in a profession, and I was in a profession where my risk tolerance, as defined by my superiors, was zero. Bring risk to zero, because we're already assuming a ton of other risks up to the step that you're at, so you don't have any tolerance here. Unfortunately, on big projects, expensive projects, you end up getting viewed as a hindering person, somebody who slows things down. You identify danger much earlier than most other people, and you start trying to mitigate it much sooner than other people. If done incorrectly, this causes delays. It causes other people to become uncertain. It can cause tension and frustration. But if you're one of these people and you're on a project and you are decently through the project, a lot of people will say, "Oh, that guy's on it, and it's at this stage, so that must mean it's going to work." So there are pros and cons to being risk averse. Then there's risk tolerant. These tend to be the opposite of the risk averse. Safety is not really on their list of preferences. They prefer to go with the flow. They trust that their coworkers and the company have already performed the appropriate due diligence. Occasionally, this puts them in situations where they fail to recognize potential risks. These people tend to fail more often, but it also means they tend to take bigger risks, either intentionally or unintentionally. And that can have benefits, right? No risk, no reward. And then there's the risk appropriate. This is somewhere in the middle. So this person tends to compromise, especially if they're dealing with two people that do both of these things, where they'll figure out what the risk tolerant person is saying. They'll listen to what the risk averse person is saying, and they'll either say something to the effect of, "I understand your risk, or your concern associated with this risk, but we deem it small enough to proceed." You want to have somebody on your project that does this. If you don't do any risk assessments at all, your supervisors are going to notice, and they're going to stop trusting you. But if you're a person like me and you probably do it too much, some of your concerns are going to get drowned out. And so you have to find a way to compromise. I personally have been getting better, where instead of trying to address all of the risks, I just tell my boss up front, "This is what I'm doing, these are my risks. I'm going to proceed anyway unless you see a problem with that." But it tends to take a while to figure out what's too much and what's not enough. And that's just ends up being practice, unfortunately. I wish I could spend more time in class talking about it. But figuring out which one you are and if you're handling it right just takes time. So let's get more into detail about a risk. So a risk is the potential that something unwanted and harmful could occur. This could be bodily harm, economic loss, environmental degradation. Risk evolves over time and is considered new if they have existed for decades, but now the public is aware of them. The magnitude of risk has genuinely changed, or the technique for identifying the risk has improved. So I'm going to go into each of those one at a time, but before I go ahead, really the big thing here is there's potential for something to happen. Now, I haven't shown any numbers yet, and I probably won't, or you really don't need to worry about it for this class. But usually there's a statistic that goes with this. There's a 1 in 10,000, there's a 1 in 100 chance of something happening. And you're supposed to assess that against the number of times you're going to do it. So if there's a 1 in 10 chance something's going to happen, you're going to do it 100 times. That means you probably should plan for it to happen 10 times, right? So this is a program that the US was running for quite a while. So George Bush actually was one of the presidents that suggested this. He had a genuine concern associated with pandemics and epidemics. Effectively, there's always been a chance that a virus could spread rapidly. People, my age group, in the 90s, there were a handful of movies about this, like Outbreak. And so there was a genuine concern. And the US, a lot of people have a hard time processing this, but they have bases everywhere. A lot of bases across the country, a lot of bases across the world. And if an American, specifically somebody in the military, gets sick, say Ebola, they still get to go home before they die. They don't just get left where they are. And so the US needed to come up with some way. How can we identify where these epidemics, pandemics might start, and how can we contain them, and how can we make sure we don't get sick? And so we came up with PREDICT. Now, what it did was, near military bases, the US would fund these laboratories, and the laboratories would give the locals basic immunity shots. So basically the leftover vaccines that the US hadn't used, that were going to go bad soon. They would start keeping track and records with the local doctors to figure out who's sick and what they have. And they would teach people in the area how to handle an outbreak. And so this was fairly strong going. It was very popular across the world. Other countries were getting involved. But then the US cut funding. It was canceled in September 2019. And this was 3 months before COVID. And I doubt it would have stopped COVID, but it would have definitely helped us contain COVID. At least slowed it down a little bit. Then there's global warming. So this has always been around, but it's slowly been getting worse to the point that it's really hard to refute it. When I was a child, when I went to South Kingstown High School, there really wasn't a ton of data showing impact. There was data showing that there was an ozone layer problem, but that was separate than global warming. And I'll be honest with you, my parents showed me reports from the 80s saying that by the 90s, the sea level would have risen so many feet, and it just hadn't, right? And I remember in the 2000s, one of my teachers, Mr. Johnson, saying that because of stuff like that, a lot of people just ignored the data, where they had been saying that the sea levels will rise and New York City will sink in the next 5 years, but they had been saying that for decades. And because of that, people who even weren't scientists, they could say, but I've heard this before. I heard that 10 years ago that it was going to happen in 5 and it didn't. Well, the technology got better, and now we could start quantifying what changes to expect, what changes we'll see, and they happen. The next is cybersecurity. So again, this risk has always been around. However, we have better tools now. And so, because we have the tools where we can prevent a lot of stuff, we can safely put more online, but you still have to follow safety rules. So for cybersecurity, a lot of the rules were reactive. So I'll give you an example. My uncle worked for a construction company, and one of the requirements when you work for a construction company, engineering firm, anything like that, is any drawings that get approved, that get stamped by a PE, you have to legally hang on to those drawings for about 30 years. And what they had done is they had digitized all of their drawings, which from an environmental standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. From a functionality standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. And what ended up happening is they got hacked and their systems got encrypted, and they couldn't get their data back until they paid a $250,000 bribe. And this is about 20 years ago. So that's even more money now. And they paid the bribe, they got the data back, but then they went to a cybersecurity firm and said, what do we do? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again? And the cybersecurity firm effectively said, well, you start putting passwords on things, number one. But number two, you have to back up your data regularly. You have to put everything that you're supposed to be protecting behind several layers of redundancy. So that meant they actually had to go get servers. And those servers would only be turned on long enough to back up the data, and then they would be shut off. And once they were shut off and taken off this offline, they would actually have to go through and do all of the testing of, is there a virus here? Are there nefarious code here? And make sure that only the things that are supposed to be there are actually there. And even today, there are whole divisions of companies that try to break into their own security systems by doing penetration tests and vulnerability scans and threat analysis. And that's their entire job, is to break into their own systems or break into neighboring systems to show them what the actual threat level is, what the actual risk is, and whether they need to take data offline. So what I'm saying is subjective. You are welcome to disagree. But I'm going to guess that everybody in class this month, at some point in time, has gone for a car ride. And I'm willing to guess that for the most part, no one had the active thought, I might die in this car. And so most people will say that's an acceptable level of risk. But that varies widely from person to person and scenario to scenario. There are reasons to accept risk. There are reasons to avoid risk. Now, this statistic that I'm using here, there's one death per 2,750,000 miles driven. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you drive 3 million miles, you're going to die, and that doesn't necessarily mean if you drive only 10, you'll live. What it means is, when you look at the number of miles driven in the United States, and you divide that by the number of deaths of people in cars, that's the number you get. And so that statistic's really only good for very large populations. Now, these are the main reasons one might change the level of risk they're willing to take. So the first one is voluntary risk. So if a person is willing to choose to engage in an activity, so like riding a motorcycle, that statistic changes quick and it becomes much lower. They might not care because at that point it's their decision. They're making the decision to go for a car ride. They're the ones making the decision to take the risk. And so from their point of view, even though there is more risk in doing that task, it's their decision, and they're reaping the benefits from it. There's the effects of knowledge. So the level of knowledge and understanding about probabilities of harm associated with specific risk can impact how individuals perceive or apprehend it. So just knowing more may lead to greater awareness and more caution, while limited knowledge may result in underestimating or overlooking the risk. There's job-related or external pressures that might force you to accept more risk. So I know I said this in a previous class, but unless you're being paid to assume extra risk, you should never do something that puts you in an unsafe position at work. But you do have to remember there are people that the only way they can afford to feed their family is to take extra risky work. And so when you go to design something, you have to keep in mind, this might be how the consumer uses my product. And so if you know, even though, you say explicitly, do not use this product in this way, if they feel that they have to, they might do it anyway, especially if somebody else is telling them to do it. There's this concept of things being immediately noticeable. So an example of this would be like walking on ice. So the risk of you falling through doesn't really change while you're standing on the ice. And so people will look at it and say, well, it doesn't look dangerous right now, so I'm going to go walk on it. And for whatever reason, people like to do this thing where they assume, because they watch a lot of movies and TV, that right before something bad happens, the music's going to play just right. And so they'll be able to react and respond. But the reality is, a lot of times when people fall through the ice, there is no sound. It just happens. And suddenly you're under the water. And so people will make this assumption, oh, I don't see anything wrong right now, and I think I'll be able to react to it in time. And they wave away all of the chances of risk that they should probably be assessing. If you give a name to somebody, so if you're a supervisor and you don't know the name of your employee, the chances that you will have them do something risky is a lot higher than if you do know their name. And so being able to identify the person who's going to be the victim of the potential actually puts you in a spot where you don't want to expose them to that. You want to go out of your way to make sure that they're not at risk. However, having said that, you as an engineer should be doing that whether you know their name or not. So there's a handful of reasons to refuse risk. You don't need to accept risk, really. In business situations where you might, if it's a financial situation, sometimes, maybe you have to absorb some risk, but in those situations, you should be safe. But right now, I'm talking about safety. So my son, Teddy, he has a very serious fear of heights, and so do I. He probably got it from me. I also have a very serious fear of horses. However, my wife rides a horse, and so I will still spend time with horses if my wife's around. However, my son, who has the same fears that I do, doesn't think anything of this horse, and he loves riding as well. And so he'll go visit Blue and get on her and ride around the riding ring. But the entire time he's doing that, all I can think about is him falling off the horse, which is a risk. There's a risk he could fall down. There's a risk that he could get trampled. And I know, generally speaking, this is a very nice horse that we have. And she does give Teddy special attention, meaning she knows he's a child and she actually behaves particularly well around him. But I've also seen her run away aggressively from a plastic bag that got loose and was floating too close to her. So I know there's a risk there. And the thing is, Teddy's been bucked off before. He's fallen off a horse before, and it was unpleasant for him, and he didn't like it. But because he's the one that is deciding to take the risk, he doesn't think anything of it. I have a friend, and she is a delivery nurse. When you go into labor, this might be one of the nurses that comes to visit you and walks you through the process of delivering. And one of the things that she did on the side was prepare people for the process of being pregnant. And when you go through the checklists, when you're dealing with newly pregnant moms, you have to go through the food that they can and can't eat. There is a serious risk, especially in the first 6 months of pregnancy, that if you were to eat any food that could get you sick, that you will cause a miscarriage. And that means you can't eat deli meat. The chance that that deli meat isn't clean, even coming directly out of the deli itself, is high enough that it's actually recommended that women don't eat it at all during their pregnancy. There's some rules around it, like if you cook it, it's not so bad, and other things. But so Steph was going through the list, and she asked this one woman, do you eat deli meat? And the woman said, no, I don't eat deli meat. Nope. And so Steph did not think anything of this, but at the bottom of her checklist is to ask directly, do you use heroin? And so Steph, her natural thought process was, if she doesn't eat deli meat because she knows it's bad for the baby, she definitely doesn't do heroin. To which the woman said is, yes, I do heroin. So Steph then proceeded to ask, are you going to try to quit while you're pregnant? And the woman said no. And Steph, being that that's not really her job, just said, okay, so we're going to have to plan around that, and went on with the conversation. But you have to think about, why did this woman say that way? And it's because it came across like Steph was trying to impose something on her. That Steph was saying, you have to change your lifestyle because it's bad for the baby. And that made her feel like she was losing autonomy. Now, in this case, I think we'd all agree heroin's bad. You should probably just stop using it in general. But there are other situations where that's not the case, where what you're doing is actually fine. And somebody comes up to you and says, you need to stop doing that because it's inconvenient for me. And the appropriate reaction might be to push back and say, no, this isn't affecting you. I'm not changing my behavior because there is no risk to you, or the risk that you're perceiving is nonsense. The next is there's a perceived lack of benefit. So I think this one's pretty straightforward. If you're assuming any level of risk, there should be the possibility or a realistic outcome of gain. But But if somebody just says, hey, do you mind assuming this risk, and I'm not going to give you anything for it, that's when you should really back up and say, I'm not doing that. I'd rather not do it at all. There's the trust and authority. So, depending on the scenario, when somebody asks you to assume risk, I frequently am telling my kids, don't do this, do that, and I'm bossing them around. And my daughter, for the most part, when I tell her to do something or not do something, she understands that there's a good reason for it. I'm not just being bossy because I want to be bossy. I have a reason for telling her to do things. And my son, from time to time, will also be bossy and try to tell her what to do, and she pushes back immediately. Now, whether my son is giving good or bad advice is totally irrelevant. Charlotte will listen to me because I'm daddy and I'm the authority. She doesn't listen to Teddy because he's her peer. And so if he tries to tell her to do something risky, unless it looks like a lot of fun, she's just going to say, no, I'm not doing that. Because she doesn't want to. At the same time, if somebody is saying you have to assume extra risk, they better have your best interests in mind. And if you can't trust them to have your best interests in mind, you should walk away. I'm not getting involved with this. I'm not dealing with you. And that trust, it just needs to be perceived trust. If you come across as an untrustworthy person, whether you are or aren't is independent, but if you come across as being untrustworthy, they're not going to assume any risk you tell them to take. There needs to be some perceived fairness when distributing risk and assuming risk. If you're taking nearly all of the risk associated with something, you should also be getting all of the reward. If somebody tries to distribute the risk evenly and you're assuming all of the risk, if somebody is trying to distribute the reward evenly, even though you're the one taking all of the risk, you should walk away. That tends to be a scam. There are other emotional and psychological factors that get involved in this. Even if the risk isn't real, but it triggers an emotion of something that is risky, especially if that person's had to deal with it before, then that's a legitimate reason to say, I'm not getting involved. All right, now I want you to read through this, and I want you to think about it. So imagine that the U.S. is preparing for an outbreak of an unusual disease originating from Asia, which is expected to kill 600 people. 2 alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed, assuming that the exact scientific estimates of the consequences of the program are as follows. Program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. Program B is adopted, there's a 1/3 chance that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 chance that no one will be saved. Which do you favor? So we're going to talk about the effects of knowledge. So the level of knowledge and understanding about the probability of harm associated with a specific risk can impact how individuals perceive and apprehend it. Enhanced knowledge may lead to greater awareness and a more cautious approach, while limited knowledge may result in underestimating or overlooking the risk. So if you were in class today, I would ask you to tell me which one you'd propose, Program A or Program B. Before you go to the next slide, actually write down an answer here. All right, so facts of knowledge. Imagine that the U.S. is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual disease originating from Asia, which is expected to kill 600 people. 200 alternative 2 alternative programs to combat the disease have been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimates of the consequence of the program are as follows. Adopt C, 400 people will die. Program D, there's a 1/3 chance that nobody will die, and a 2/3 chance 600 people will die. Which do you favor? Before you answer, or before you go to the next slide, please write down an answer. All right, so the options, when you look at them, perceived as yielding firm gains, will tend to be preferred over those from which gains are perceived as risky or only probable. Options emphasizing firm losses will tend to be avoided in favor of those whose chances of success are perceived as probable. Now, I want you to think about something else here. What were the differences between those two options, or two sets of options? Nothing. They were the same options. They were just phrased different. Well, the thing is, option A, when it was phrased that way, was favored 80% of the time. However, when the wording was switched, it was only favored 20% of the time. But effectively, it was the same option. And unfortunately, that is one of the reasons you can't rely on the general public to make good decisions. So these are reasons to assume risk. So the first is economic necessity. So like I said earlier, when you're designing something, you have to remember there are going to be people who are going to use your product incorrectly because from a financial standpoint, they genuinely have to, which is unfortunate. And so you also have to remember in the US, a lot of people are living paycheck to paycheck. So you missing your paycheck, it could lead to genuine life or death scenarios. Am I going to get to eat this week? I don't know. It depends on whether I get the work done. So if your boss offers you higher pay, but that means you have to go do something hazardous, a lot of people will take it. Now, the way you quantify that tends to be subjective. It tends to be, if I do that thing and I get injured, how much money will I lose by not being able to go to work? And then you add some factor to that, and that's what you demand for pay up front. In certain job-related risks, individuals may feel a greater sense of control or mastery over the situation. So, if you're using a dangerous piece of equipment like a motorcycle, but you have gone through all of the special training and you have all the PPE to make sure that if you fall off that bike, you won't be hurt as much. And this might instill a level of confidence in the operator. Whether that's the genuine case is subjective. Whether some motorcycle riders are safer than others, I don't know. Never been on a motorcycle. But the same thing applies when doing certain jobs. If they know what they're doing, they do believe that they have control over the situation, it might not be that hazardous. A good example of this is flying planes. A lot of people outside looking in, it looks very dangerous, but people who know what they're doing realize it's really not as dangerous as you'd imagine. If the organization you work for goes out of its way to minimize the dangers. So there are certain pieces of equipment that are very dangerous to use, but if the company intentionally makes it so for you to do it by accident to hurt yourself is nearly impossible, you're not really taking extra risk, right? So in those scenarios, it's okay to work near the dangerous tools, the dangerous animals, the dangerous products. There's the perception of benefit. Unfortunately, this just needs to be a perception. It doesn't need to be real. But if For example, firefighters accept the risk associated with their profession because they recognize the essential nature of their work as saving lives and protecting the community. The perceived importance and meaningfulness of the job can outweigh the risks involved. And depending on where you live and who your family is, um, you might be culturally required, peer pressured, all that jazz, into assuming more risk. An example of this is like in the military. Certain tasks, generals, admirals, captains, all them, they can't tell you to do certain things if it's dangerous. They can only ask you if you want to do it. And it's not that common for soldiers who have been trained to do a certain task to say no, just because they've been trained to do it and they're going in with their brothers, so why wouldn't they just do it? All right, so before you ever assume risk, you always want to assess the risk and you want to minimize the risk first. So these are the four main things that you have to take into account. So there's uncertainty in the design. So you're never ever going to intentionally design a product to be dangerous. It might be inherently dangerous, but you're never going to, add razor blades to the side for funsies. You're going to go out of your way to make it less dangerous as often as you can. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is you are going to pay for risk. You are going to pay for it at some point in time. You're either going to literally pay cash up front to make the risk go away, or you are going to eat it afterwards. So that means if you have the opportunity to design something to be safer, so think of the wood chipper scenario. You can design it to be safer so that nobody hurts themselves while they use it, or you can get sued and pay for the person who lost his fingers. These tend to be the things that cause the design to get or have uncertainty in the design. So the number one is the change in customer requirements. So literally, the way the customer is using it changes, and that's normal. Another is sometimes customers communicate poorly what they actually need. They'll tell you what they think they need, but as time progresses, it becomes clear they don't know, and they've asked for the wrong things. And so you have to go out of your way to be on top of that. You have to know what your customers want before they ask for it. And you have to pay attention to how the customers are using the product you're giving them. The next is technical limitations. So you live in the US, you're probably going to work in the US. So we don't really make stuff anymore, at least not in mass quantities. If you're manufacturing something, it's either some kind of medical thing, or it's some kind of product that you would make tens of millions of a day. Other than that, you do what's called LRIP, low rate initial production, at which point you are intentionally pushing the limits of technology. So that means your customer is asking for something that hasn't been done yet. And so there's a risk associated with that. The product you're making might not work. And when it fails, it might not necessarily be, people get hurt, but you're competing with other people. And if your product doesn't work, but the guy next to you, his does, he's going to be paid and you're not. There's cost and resource constraints. So you could do it correctly, but that would cause the price of the product to go up, and then you can't sell it. And then there's compliance issues. Now, this comes in two flavors. One of them is your company reads the codes and interprets them one way. And for this, that, and the other reason, the regulator doesn't have a defined this is the exact way you should be interpreting this law. And so you make the product thinking you're complying with the law, and you go to court because something happens and somebody interpreted it another way, and da 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 da. That's risk. So you always want to be more conservative when you're trying to comply with unclear laws. The other thing that happens is sometimes the laws change. So if you're not grandfathered in, you do have to change the product to meet what the new law is. So this is Enger's Bridge. This is changing customer requirements. So it was designed to allow for more than 1,000 people, which is equivalent to 1 battalion, to cross at a time. Earlier that day, 2 battalions had crossed. Normally nobody was on the bridge during storms, and the bridge wasn't designed to be used during storms. In the afternoon, a 3rd battalion was crossing during a storm. Now, when this happened, the soldiers themselves actually acted as a sail. So the force load on the bridge was higher than it should have been during the storm. This caused swaying. In addition to that, soldiers march in unison, meaning they pick up their left foot and the right foots at the same time, and this causes a resonance, which caused the, not stopping, but the stepping to be more force than you'd expect. So this combination of swaying and stepping in unison caused the bridge to collapse, and this is a case of changing needs. Then there's the Pinto. This is a compliance issue. So Ford knew that their car design would light on fire during an accident even if it weren't on or moving. Ford knew the law allowed this design to exist. Ford also knew that the law was going to be updated. So Ford's interpretation of the law said that they didn't need to change the design if the first lot of cars were sold before the new law was introduced, which is what they did. Once the law was updated, Ford refused updating the design, citing the fact that they were grandfathered in. And legally, they were. It's a terrible thing to say, but yeah, they were grandfathered in. And legally, the payment or cost to Ford wasn't very high. And so what Ford ended up doing is, instead of notifying the general public that this would happen, what they did instead is they went and told people, or they didn't tell anybody. When there was a car accident and somebody died because of this, they would just pay them out. So it was cheaper to do that than it was to do a recall. However, in the court of public opinion, this ended up being really bad for Ford. Nowadays, you can't go buy a Pinto, but you can buy a Ford Taurus, and Ford Tauruses in their trunks have actual machines that cause the fuel pump to shut off. And it's because of this. The Ford Taurus's design was based off of the Pintos. Now, this is a market issue. So when I made this slide, this was the most up-to-date chip you could buy. So that chip is about 40 nanometers thick. 10 nanometers is about the thickness of one atom. So that pin is about 4 atoms thick. That's really hard to make. Every commercial product that does any level of thinking requires a device like this. You can only make these in Taiwan. Now, all of the manufacturers, Samsung, Ford, Sony, Microsoft, assumed that these manufacturers would be able to supply their demands and told customers that they'd be able to produce accordingly. Now, what happened was something a bit different. So what happened was Samsung, Ford, Sony, Microsoft, they individually went to the chip manufacturer and said, we would like to buy 1 million chips next year. And the factory said, okay, put a purchase order in and we'll get started. And Samsung, Ford, Sony, and Microsoft waited for October 1st to put an order in. And the chip manufacturer came back and said, so here's the deal. We could make enough for one of you, not the four of you. In addition to that, it was October 1st, 2019, meaning in 2 months, COVID-19 was going to hit hard. So the factories would just shut down. And so there was an actual technical limitation. Those companies either had to accept that there was going to be a huge delay in delivering their products, or they had to redesign their product. Now, the risk here isn't safety. The risk here is cost and schedule. The cost of that redesign was going to be huge. The cost or the schedule push was going to cost them money, literally. And it's unfortunate. Now, another thing that happens, and this wasn't necessarily the government's fault, but it was something the government had to deal with. At the time, I was working on torpedoes, and torpedoes buy computer chips, but we don't buy anything that's fancy. And the thing is, so this one Taiwanese company was the only one who could make these chips. But there were plenty of other factories across the world that could make similar chips. And suddenly those factories realized making the similar chips was a lot more profitable than making the chips that they were making. So every factory that was in existence started making the higher end version of what they could already make, because this caused a huge demand. So this is the ultra high capability chips. The medium capability chip manufacturers started making the high capability chips. The low capability chip manufacturers started making the medium grade chips. And if you needed to buy the low grade chips because that's what your design called for, well, it's no longer being produced. And you had to find a way to get one of these better chips in there, which drove the cost of all of the chips up. So you want to do some kind of risk-based analysis before you ever make a big decision. And like I said earlier, you're engineers, you are not firemen, you are not police officers, you're not soldiers. You should be able to sit back and say, I need to think about this. I need to assess the risk that I might need to deal with. So first you need to define all of your risks. Identify what they are. Then you want to identify the benefits. And then you want to quantify the risk. Now, I have a very simple risk-benefit chart here. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to make two charts. The first one is you define the chance of something happening on the bottom. And then you define the cost of it happening on the left. And then you try to place, with the best of your ability, you put every risk on that chart. And then you try to quantify what's the most expensive to me. So this is an example of one of those charts. Now, a lot of people, what they'll say is, I'm only willing to accept level 1. Some people will say, I'm only willing to accept level 2, so on and so forth. If one of your proposals ends up being in one of these red areas where you can't accept that risk, you then have to start doing the risk-benefit analysis and saying, okay, if I assume this risk, the payout of me assuming this risk must be this dollar amount. And then you have to start considering mitigation tactics. And then you have to evaluate your decision on options. All right, so this is another example that we'll do in class. The city's infrastructure department plans to build a new bridge to enhance transportation connectivity and accommodating increasing traffic demands. As the material engineer assigned to the project, you are responsible for selecting the appropriate material for the bridge's construction. The goal is to ensure that the bridge's long-term durability, safety, and cost-effectiveness while considering the potential risks and benefits associated with the various material options. So your material options are steel, reinforced concrete, or a composite material. So first you'd want to identify the risks. So if you're in class, I'd actually talk to you. What's the risk with each of these things? And then I ask you about the benefits. So if you're watching this, write these down. Figure out what the risks and what the benefits of these things are. And then try to quantify the costs or cost savings to each of those. And then try to justify which one you would use. So based off of your risk-benefit analysis and judgment from your supervisor, you determined that using reinforced concrete for the bridge construction would provide the most favorable outcome. It offers a balance between structural performance, cost-effectiveness, and proven reliability by implementing appropriate corrosion protection measures and regular maintenance. The bridge can have a long lifespan while minimizing risk associated with material degradation. So you do need to make an informed decision. So I don't know what the current state of the technology is when it comes to composites, but you do have to actually weigh the cost. So concrete has some inherent costs up front to install, steel has some inherent cost up front to install, and so does the composite. Then you have to do the cost of maintenance. It's hard for a lot of people to process, but infrastructure, roads, bridges do require maintenance. And what's the cost of doing that maintenance? So if you look at the Newport Bridge, that's a steel bridge. And if you use it regularly, you'll know that it regularly gets painted. The reason it regularly gets painted is because it corrodes. Now, it was supposed to use a particular type of steel that you only needed to paint once a decade. Because of shipping and scheduling and supply errors, that's not what they got. And so now there's an inherent cost of owning that bridge. Yes, it's a pretty bridge, but it needs to be painted every year, and those toll booths aren't going anywhere because of it. However, if they used a different material, specifically concrete, that wouldn't have been such a big deal. At the same time, you need longevity. Now, like I said, I don't know the current state of composites, but you don't want to be the engineer that assumes the risk of being the first one to build a bridge out of some composite and then find out after 10 years, oh, hey, this issue you didn't know about because no one had done this once yet has just popped its ugly little head, and now you have to rebuild the bridge. Because people remember stuff like that. And it's a really good way to damage your reputation. Now, the next type of risk people will assume is voluntary risk or personal risk. Voluntary risk is the risk that an individual is willing to take. These risks are consciously accepted by individuals, often driven by personal preference, desire, or willingness to explore new experiences. So these usually come in the form of hobbies: skydiving, rock climbing, extreme skiing, things like that. One thing I would like to point out, every time I've taught this lesson, including today, I get an email from somebody saying, I hurt myself doing sports. And so that would be an example of somebody assuming a risk, knowing full well it could happen, because there's a personal gain to them. The next is professions. So that's things like firefighting, undersea welding, or the military. The next is habits: smoking, eating too much, not exercising, drinking a lot of alcohol. Then you have to consider public risk. People will assume voluntary risk that is 1,000 times more dangerous than involuntary risk. So that is risk that somebody else imposes on you. The risk that individuals are exposed to without their direct choice or control. These risks are imposed upon individuals due to circumstances or factors beyond their influence or decision. There's environmental factors. These are things like earthquakes, floods, hurricanes. There's societal conditions, unemployment, war, poverty, pandemics. And then there's the actions of others. You don't want to take a risk because of somebody else's negligence or because somebody's committing a crime. But most importantly, you don't want to assume product liability. If somebody handed you a Samsung S7, you wouldn't want to use it because it could also function as a grenade. Or is it the Note 7? I forget. I'm trying to make a joke here. So the public wants the impossible. They want zero risk, even though that's impossible. Logically, you know that can't happen. The fact that you could put the pieces together to show that something's possible means zero risk doesn't exist. Them knowing about it means there's no such thing as zero risk. They want to substitute facts with opinions and beliefs, even though that's dangerous. It is difficult to define what consent genuinely is. For example, when TF Green was built, there weren't very many houses near it, and the locals didn't mind that it was put there. However, as time passed, more houses were built around the airport. So does buying a house near the airport after it was built mean you're giving consent to listen to airplanes land and take off? So this is an opinion, but my opinion is there's no reason you shouldn't know that the airplanes are there when you're buying the house, because they will let you know, because they're landing and taking off, and that shit's loud. But that isn't a universal opinion. There are other people that disagree with me. For LNG import terminals, the risk is owned by the port city, and the benefit is distributed to the whole state. Therefore, the city enforces a system of taxes on all of the natural gas that passes through the city. A good example of this was there's an import terminal in Savannah, Georgia. And that import terminal provides all of the natural gas from Florida to New York City. That's a huge area, right? However, Savannah, Georgia is absorbing all of the risk associated with that facility. If something goes bad, the only thing New Yorkers are going to experience is a jump in the price of gas. Is that a fair distribution of risk and benefit? I don't know. The city has imposed some extra laws and taxes to justify it, but that's generally the thought process. All right, so now we're going to talk about 3 Mile Island. Now, I don't particularly like talking about nuclear power because there's much more misinformation than objective information. And it takes more energy to argue misinformation than the people who provide it are willing to absorb. Next is feelings tend to run pretty high on this subject, and it makes it impossible to have an objective discussion. I do think it's an important discussion, because I do think a lot of people in this room do find the issue of global warming a real problem. And when you look at the math, at least as of this year, the amount of silicon we have and the amount of space we have for windmills isn't approaching the demand fast enough to satisfy the electric demand. However, there is enough nuclear to satisfy the electric demand. And the chances that all of the nuclear power plants, or that Americans in general will stop consuming electricity, is very low. So I'm going to give you some background. 3 Mile Island was commissioned in 1974. It was decommissioned in 2019. It's in the process of being recommissioned as we speak by Microsoft. The reactor was built by Babcock and Wilcox. That company was founded in Providence, an interesting tidbit since we are in Rhode Island, and it had a partial reactor meltdown in March of 1979. So this is the P&ID, Piping and Instrument Diagram for 3 Mile Island. So on the particular day that this happened, at least it started on, there was what was referred to as a water interrupt event. Around the area I'm pointing to, there's a valve that's not shown there. It was a control valve, and it had gotten sticky. For whatever reason, it would only be full open or full shut, and they needed it to be fluctuating between 50 and 75%, and they couldn't get the level of precision they needed. And they had an actual procedure for this. Effectively, what they would do is they would rapidly open and shut that valve and cause whatever was causing it to be stuck, to be sticky, to become unstuck. So they did that. Well, when they did that, that activated the emergency response system. And the emergency response system said, I need to shut down now. Now, the thing is, they knew this was going to happen. They had planned for this to happen. So the shutdown starts. And this causes these pipes here to deactivate, or these pumps to deactivate. So the system, this heat exchanger, stops pulling heat out of the reactor vessel. Now again, they were planning on this to happen. This causes the interior temperature of that reactor vessel to go up, which causes the scram system to activate. The scram system comes down, starts to shut off the reactor, but the pressure is built enough within the reactor that the relief valve has to open. Again, this was supposed to happen. The relief valve goes, all of the steam in the reactor vessel evacuates, causing it to cool down. And then it failed open. Now that wasn't supposed to happen. What was supposed to happen was it was supposed to open for a little bit, the reactor was supposed to cool down, and then it was supposed to close again. It didn't close again. So now the reactor is just getting hotter, and they don't know what to do. So they activate the emergency coolant system. This would have flooded the reactor with cold water and cooled it off. Would have stopped the reaction from occurring. That didn't happen. What did happen was the day before they had done maintenance on those pumps, and they had closed the valves to remove the pumps and put new pumps in. And the procedure was to open the pumps again when they were done, and they didn't do that. And so when they activated those pumps, nothing happened. So that reactor just sat there getting hotter and hotter and hotter until it melted. So this is what we think happened. It is not safe at the moment to go in and check, and it won't be safe to go in and check for a long time unless you do some special procedure, which my understanding is what they actually plan on doing. However, this is what we believe the current state of the reactor is. The nuclear rods melted, and they made this slag, and that slag stopped reacting because instead of being in proximity to each other, it was just overlapping with itself. Now this is the immediate response to 3 Mile Island. So at basically 7 in the morning, power plant realizes what's happened. So they contact the Pennsylvania EPA, PEPA. PEPA immediately contacted the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Pennsylvania governor, and the Pennsylvania lieutenant governor. After 16 hours, the core temperature fell enough for operators to assess the damage. After 24 hours, somebody actually went in and checked the damage. The way he described it was he had an intense metallic taste in his mouth walking in. This means that he got irradiated beyond the legal limit. And this is in 1979, so I'm sure the legal limit is now a lot lower. And then after 28 hours, the plant operators recommended to the Pennsylvania governor and lieutenant governor to evacuate the area. Now, there's a lot of complaints about the series of events. And my observation is when you look at the communications the power plant engineers had with the politicians, the power plant people were giving all of the accurate information, but they were not using terminology that the politicians understood. And so they would say things like risk and safe, and the politicians took that to mean high risk, unsafe. And so you have to remember who you're talking to when you give them information. Nothing the engineer said was inaccurate, it was just interpreted wrong, and that interpretation was then provided to the state of Pennsylvania, to the point that from time to time the plant operators would actually have to contact the news and say, we never said that, that's not what we said, this is the accurate piece of information. And this is another instance of the PA, the governor and lieutenant governor saying things like, oh, there's a hierarchy to things, and this is how you should go through the hierarchy to explain. No, this is a safety issue. If you're going to explain it wrong, we need to explain it. If you're going to explain it to get political ground, we need to explain it. All right, so I'm going to come back to this, or if you were in class, I would come back to this slide, but I want you to think about this. If you're at home, answer these questions. Can you see anything inherently wrong or unethical with what the plant operators did? A debate exists over the timing. It took 28 hours to evacuate the area. There clearly was inadequate training of the operators. The emergency relief valve didn't shut because the operators didn't see a blinking light. Communication, the general public, politicians didn't understand what the plant operators were telling them in plain English. How much of the problem was rooted in the fact that it was an emergency? All right, now we're going to talk about Chernobyl. People love to compare Chernobyl to 3 Mile Island. I think that is a disingenuous comparison. So this is the reactor to 3 Mile Island. So first they disconnected the emergency core cooling system. Then they removed the control rods. Then they activated the extra pumps. Then there was xenon buildup in the system. And then because the xenon warning system started to alarm, they deactivated it. After that, the core simply got hotter and hotter. This caused the steam pressure of the reactor to grow as well. It's known as the AZ5 button, or it was known that the AZ5 button was pressed before detonation, but it's unclear if this caused the explosion or if the explosion would have happened anyway. If you watched the miniseries, they explain it really well. One thing I can say is if the AZ button really did have carbon on it, at the temperature that they're talking about, the carbon would react with the water, and that would cause an explosive reaction. This is the aftermath of Chernobyl. That circular structure at the bottom weighed several tons. After the explosion, it had clearly been flipped upside down. This entire structure was destroyed. So this is the immediate response to the events. So, at 1:30 in the morning, the explosion occurred. Local authorities in Moscow initially described the incident as a minor fire and of no concern. After 52 hospitalizations, this is 36 hours later, evacuations of Pripyat was ordered. After 10 days, an exclusionary radius was set to 30 kilometers. A total of 350 residents had to be resettled. After Eastern European early warning systems ID'd this as an extreme radiation event, the USSR acknowledged there was a problem. So literally, Sweden's warning system that a nuclear bomb went off started going off. And that's when they said, hey, what's going on? We can detect an enormous amount of radiation coming from this area. This is a satellite photo taken by the US of the area. So if you're not in class, I want you to answer these. Can you see anything wrong or inherently unethical, especially compared to 3 Mile Island? And there is debate associated with the safety systems, the lack of transparency of information, and human error negligence. I would love to assign a homework of watch the mini-series, but I might get in trouble for that. However, as somebody who just likes watching TV, I would strongly recommend you watch it.